our hour today, we thought we'd spend the first 20-30 minutes talking about trauma and some background information, some of the reasons why social emotional health is indeed so critical, and then we'll spend the second half of our time together filling your pockets with some strategies of how to teach kids about their brains and also how to teach kids how to use breath to regulate their nervous system. We would love to hear from you what ages of kids or adults that you work with. So if you can use your fancy webinar stuff and tell us what you are doing in the work world and with what ages, that would be great to hear you chime in.
Yeah, if you'll just, you can type that into the Q&A section. We would love to know.
Yeah. So Dan, I'm not getting a response from the PowerPoint. Are you able to get it to move?
No, if it's frozen again though, I can pull it up on my computer.
That would be awesome. So Dan's going to pull the PowerPoint up, but the first slide we're going to see is really just a representation of what Momentous Institute encompasses. So I can talk you through that just briefly so you have that grid. We're in Dallas, Texas, and we work with over 6,000 people a year directly. Most of those people are served in our mental health work, and they're dealing with all kinds of presenting issues, prenatal through 15, and their families. And most are also living with the added layer of poverty. Through that work, we developed an innovation school that is 3-year-olds through 5th graders, and that's for 248 kids and their families, also whom are mostly dealing with poverty. In fact, I don't know how much background noise is picked up right now, but we're on the opposite wall of dismissal, and it's a rainstorm, so you may hear some delightful little kid sounds, not sure. The third part of our work has to do with research and training. So we work with educators, mental health professionals, decision makers across the country in hopes of helping far more kids than we could ever serve directly. So if you see the next slide, this really kind of grounds you in what our name is about. We were noting that ourselves and our partners across the country were accidentally learning so much about risk factors that it was shifting our view of what was possible for kids. And we felt like it was really important to put a stake in the ground, to expect momentous outcomes, use what we know about risk factors to intervene smartly, but never shift from that expecting momentous outcomes for every kid that you come in contact with and we come in contact with. We rebranded to that name 2.5 years ago. We're about a 96-year-old organization, though, so we've had lots of time to marinate and course correct, and we're in constant learning mode. One more quick little piece of information on the next slide, which will give you a little bit of grounding of why we feel so passionate about sharing our work and sharing our message. The kids in our school, at Momentous School, are 3-year-olds through 5th grade. They are with us, and then they launch into 6th through 12th, most in the Dallas area. They're in 60 different middle and high schools, some great, some terrible, some everything in between. And we're still seeing 7 years later, 99% graduate high school, 86% go on to higher education, and 87% go into that sophomore year. So that really lit a fire under us to say something is happening in these early years that is sticking. If you look at the next slide, we'll tell you we've spent a lot of time thinking about our formula. And of course it's complicated, which is true for every one of y'all in your workspaces too. But we're convinced that the #1 reason we're seeing those outcomes is because we focus on social emotional health as much as we focus on academics. And so what that translates into is that we are ensuring that children can manage their internal worlds regardless of what comes at them externally, that they can manage their emotions, communicate well, that they see the world through a lens that's grateful and optimistic, that they have had lots of practice with persevering, making friends with failure. All of that good stuff falls under the umbrella of social emotional health. If you look at the next slide, you'll see that the research is very clear. This is just one example. There's a fast track study that came out that looked at kindergartners and their prosocial behaviors and followed them to see how things turned out for them as adults. And you'll note that for the kindergartners that had stronger prosocial behaviors, they had better education, better employment, better mental health. They also saw less substance abuse and less criminal activity. So this is definitely not just a game changer in the short term, but it's a game changer in the long term as well. We hear lots of people get a little snagged on the both and. I don't have any time. I need to focus my energy on academics. Social emotional health is great, but it's not for me, or it's not my job. Our work has shown us, and the research backs it up, that it really is a both and. That if you don't have that capacity to self-regulate and build relationships, it's really challenging to plug into the academics as much as you can, and we hope you will. There is a meta-analysis that looked at 200 studies, and they found that the kids who were exposed to this kind of work also did about 11 points better on assessments. So it definitely is a both and. So I'm going to take a break before we dive into some trauma information and see what Heather is picking up from you all.
Yeah, so it looks like we've got folks working with a wide range of ages. High school age girls, pre-K through 5th grade. We've got some college freshmen, folks working with college freshmen, 3rd through 5th grade students, all ages working with mindfulness. We love that. Mindfulness is a huge piece of the work that we do here. And then tricks for families with adopted children returning to their birth countries. Amazing. And Project Transformation. Hey,
Our friends.
we are friends.
Several of our
Welcome.
friends we see on there.
Yeah,
Very
so
good.
welcome to all of you.
Perfect. So we will now dive into just a little bit of a trauma lens. And we found in our work with teachers across the country, and Dan, thank you, Dan, that truly you don't have to have a master's degree in psychology to shift how you're looking at the child across from you. You really can have about an inch deep understanding of trauma in order to shift your lens and have a more compassionate view of difficult behavior. So that's what we'll try to go into a little bit today. If you look at the next slide, it breaks down a little bit the ACEs study, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, a really groundbreaking piece of work. If you're interested in it and haven't heard much about it, I really encourage you to look at the TED Talk that Nadine Burke-Harris did. It's terrific, and you'll grasp it completely with that 15-minute investment. I'll hit the highlights. Basically, bad things happen to to young children. Without intervention, you see problems all the way along, including early death. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that this is what they looked at, that they classified as adverse childhood experiences. So what you might expect, like abuse and neglect, but also some household factors, domestic violence, incarcerated relative, divorce, substance abuse, and mental illness in the home. So take a look at this next slide. One of the things that we've noted is that in addition to these adverse childhood experiences, families who are navigating poverty are under tremendous stress, and very often under what's classified as toxic stress, a kind of pressure that is literally rewiring brains. So we have a 1-minute video for you out of Harvard that really breaks down and describes what is it that's happening physiologically when we or children are experiencing toxic stress. So take a look.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and encouraging.
So it was a little, we got somebody's comment, thank you so much, that it was a little hard to hear that video. If you Google just Harvard Center on the Developing Child Toxic Stress, this video and several other short videos that are also a good resource will come up. But I imagine just looking at it, even if you had trouble hearing, that you picked up the main piece of it, which is that we have children in that heightened fight, flight, or freeze state, and they're not going back to baseline, and then they're walking into our classrooms, and at face value, we think they are feeling inside the same way the child next to them is feeling who's had their needs met, and that they're equally capable of plugging into their academics. And what's so dangerous about not having the trauma lens is that if you don't have it, you can look at that child who's either shutting down or acting out and create a story that is, you know, why are you defiant? Why don't you care? Any of these natural ways we try to explain behavior, but very often it's better explained by trauma. So we want to do just a brief little experiment with you. Pick something safe, obviously, take care of yourself with this, but think about the last time that you had that fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Perhaps you were in an airplane and there was turbulence, or maybe a car and someone was coming at you and you had to react quickly. So just take about 15 seconds and remember, and if you can jot down in the Q&A, a few of you, some examples, that would be great. So I don't know about you all, but for me, traffic is what always comes up, and what I'm hoping will happen for you as you reconnect to that last time you felt that is that you'll remember how intensely uncomfortable it is. It does its job because it shuts down our thinking brain and it allows us to react quickly, but it is very uncomfortable. And most of us have the luxury of going back to baseline after we take care of whatever the scary thing was. So I would ask you then to imagine what it would be like to sustain that uncomfortable feeling over the course of hours and even days. And then what it would be like to have a teacher, an adult, put a math problem in front of you or ask you to read an English passage when you are in that physiological state. And if you take a look at this next, Patty mentioned short of breath, that she felt that short of breath piece. That's absolutely right. If you take a look at this next slide, I hope you're able to see it well. What it shows you is on the left-hand side, a child's brain, a 3-year-old, an fMRI of a child's brain where they've had their needs met. And on the right-hand side, a child's brain, 3-year-old fMRI, where there was abuse and neglect. And you know, again, no punchline in the fact that we don't want bad things to happen to young children, but it is relatively new news that it literally changes kids' brains. And so if you'll notice, that bright red light indicates activity. And so the brain on the right, if you'll notice the absence of that bright red light at the top of the screen, that's the prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of our brain where we do our best thinking, where we inhibit behavior, and that on this fMRI, there's virtually no activity there. And that's a result of that abuse and neglect. So it literally changes kids' brains. It hijacks their brain architecture when they have traumatic experiences. On this next slide, I really like this slide because it kind of crystallizes what the difference is between tolerable stress and toxic stress. And you'll note that really bad things can happen to young children and they'll stay in that yellow zone of tolerable stress. But what takes it into that toxic space is two things. One is that prolonged activation that we saw in the video, that prolonged fight, flight, or freeze. And then the second one is the absence of protective relationships. So this was very direction setting for us at Momentous Institute because we thought, okay, in a way that's a path forward in terms of program development and where we put our resources. We have to figure out how to teach kids how to self-regulate, how to manage their internal world with stressors coming at them from the outside. You've probably heard the quote, we do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. So if we can help children manage what's going on for them internally, then even with very significant stressors coming at them externally, it creates a buffer. And then the second one, of course, how do we participate in building community and strengthening parents and making sure teachers and every adult in the building knows that there is no neutral interaction with a child. If you have an interaction with a child and you miss the opportunity to connect and to make them feel seen and felt, then that goes in the negative column. Doesn't go in the neutral column. And so just ensuring that every single adult that we can possibly recruit is in that mindset of becoming a protective relationship and a buffer. The phenomenal news from the resiliency literature is that it actually only takes one safe relationship in the life of a child to shift the trajectory. So I'm betting that many of you that are on this webinar right now are in the lives of some kids where you might feel like you are that safe relationship. You are the one who is creating that buffer. So moving on to the next slide. What you are seeing here is our interpretation of A, how do you attend to keeping as few kids as possible out of that red bar and into the yellow, and B, how do you break down social emotional health and make it actionable. So this is the model that we developed here. We're tweaking it all the time, like everything, but we wanted to have something that people could work from. And I'll just point out a few things about it. The first and most important is that the ground underneath all of this work is safe relationships. Without safe relationships, the rest of it really truly is noise. And even more, it could cross over into harmful. And let me say more about that. Kids do better with congruent adults who are never available emotionally than they do with adults who are talking about social emotional health 1 minute and then yelling or shaming the next minute. And it doesn't mean we have to be perfect, because every one of us has been in that yelling space with a kid, at least our own kids. Please tell me I'm not the only one. But it definitely means we have to track on how do you create that safe environment for kids so that your actions and your words match. And the other crucial piece of that is when we get it wrong, we have to notice and we have to repair. So we have to be able to tell when we have not handled a situation with a kid in a way that is pro-social. And then we have to have the skill set and the prioritization to go to them and say, you know, I wish that I hadn't handled it that way. I'd really like to talk to you about this instead of yelling, or whatever that small move of repair is. The other thing I'll point out is that while the model is a stair-step model, it isn't a linear process, and this won't surprise any of you, but you know, none of us conquer self-regulation and then move on to awareness of self. You're working on all of it all the time. However, developmental stage matters a lot in terms of where you might be working the most, and temperament comes into that too. The reason we liked the stair step is because very often as people who are in the lives of kids will accidentally be intervening at one step when the child is at a completely different place. And I'll just give you a brief example. Two kids on the playground fighting. A really smart, well-meaning, activated teacher walks over and says, hey, tries to help them work it out. Can you imagine how Johnny's feeling? That's actually a great question, but it's a green bar question. And so if one or both of the children are in that red zone of, you know, Elvis has left the building, they're all primitive part of their brain, all fight, flight, or freeze, they can't hear or internalize a question like, can you imagine how Johnny's feeling? So we think it's helpful to pay attention the next time you feel a little stuck with a kid. Where might they be in that moment? And where's your intervention? And is it a mismatch or is it a match? With that, we'll go on to the next slide. Want to just kind of prepare you a little bit for the time that Heather will spend unpacking some strategies, because what we've noticed in our work with teachers and counselors and decision makers is that it's kind of a two-part strategy. One is perspective shifts and the other is those applied strategies. And this also is a very helpful lens. It's been very helpful to us for sure. When you feel stuck with a child, you ought to look at this and ask yourself, do I need a perspective shift? And an example of that would be if you've got the story of the child pretty locked in, like this child is defiant, this child is bad, this child doesn't care. Anything that feels locked in, you might need a perspective shift. You might need to introduce that trauma lens or even just a context lens. What else might be going on with this child that's creating this unhelpful, unproductive behavior? I read something from someone once where they said, you know, when you're standing across from a kid that's acting in a way that's off-putting, to reframe it as a coping crisis, which I found so useful. Just don't get triggered by the bad behavior. Instead, think, okay, this child is having a coping crisis. What do they need from me to develop skills? The second piece, though, because sometimes you are in exactly the right perspective. You are coming at it from a completely solid perspective that's open and generous and compassionate, but you have no idea what to do. And that's when you need that yellow circle of applied strategies. So we offer that to you as just a lens. When you feel stuck, check in with yourself. Is this about perspective shifts or is this about needing strategies? Take a look at the next slide. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about the ground floor, and then we're going to dive into the red bar of self-regulation with Heather. We talked about the importance of safe relationships. We're going to talk just almost obscenely briefly about attachment, which is such a huge topic. If you look at the next slide, what you're seeing is the healthy attachment cycle. So child has a need, child expresses a need, the need is met by an adult, and then trust develops, right? That's what you want to see happen. We'll use the example of wet diaper, baby cries, adult comes and notices what needs to happen, changes the diaper, trust develops, right? In a perfect scenario, that's happening on a really regular basis. Like I said earlier, does not have to happen all the time. In fact, it just needs to happen about 40% of the time if when we get it wrong, we notice and we repair. And your child or the child you're working with will develop a secure attachment, which brings me to the next page. And again, we've so oversimplified this, but we hope it's useful to you. When a child has that secure attachment background and or a secure attachment with the teacher, then often, never always, but often you're going to see that child acting content, engaged, on task. I'm imagining many of you are thinking of kids that are in your realm that seem content, engaged, on task most of the time. They may be coming from that secure attachment. There's 3 categories, though, that are insecure attachment. The first one is that avoidant, which what you might see from the child in terms of outward behaviors: withdrawn, quiet, or checked out. And so what's happening for that child is, when you think back to that attachment cycle, their needs weren't met. So they had a need, expressed it, nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened. So what they've learned is, I'm just going to fade into the woodwork. You know, better safe, better silent than a target. There's no need for me to even speak up because it doesn't meet my needs when I do. Again, super, super oversimplified. There are plenty of kids who have days like this and they have a secure attachment. Same with the ambivalent. What you might see in the child is anxious behavior, lack of focus, just kind of a general insecurity. Again, many kids have anxiety who are securely attached. But with the ambivalent attachment style, what's happened is it's just confusing for them when you think of that cycle. Sometimes their needs are met, sometimes they aren't. They can't figure out the rules of the game, and so they're just anxious. So even when their needs are met one time, they're always waiting for that shoe to drop. So they're just not sure how to make sense of things. And then the final one is the one we worry the most about, that angry, depressed, not following directions, short fuse, difficulty making friends. And these kids often are growing up in an environment where one or both parents are terrified or terrifying. So when you think back to the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, imagine kids who are growing up in homes where there's domestic violence, and maybe they experience one parent as terrified and one as terrifying. That is a child who is in that fight, flight, or freeze mode a lot of the time. It's difficult for them to go back to baseline. So I'll finish up my portion by just sharing with this last slide that in addition to children having attachment backgrounds, we do too. And it's really important to pay attention to what happened in your attachment history and whether or not that's influencing the lens you have on any particular child. It's not unusual for certain children to trigger us more than others, and sometimes the clues in why that's happening are traced back to this attachment piece. So forgive the obnoxious surface coverage of such a huge topic, but we hope that that does create a new lens for you as you're looking at tricky situations with particular kids. Now we're going to transition into that red bar that looks at self-regulation with Heather, and she and I are going to switch seats so I can monitor your questions while she dives in. Thank you, guys.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and jump to the next slide, which is how we introduce these concepts to the students in our school. And I know a lot of you are working with older kids. You'll see pictures of our younger kids, but hopefully the concepts, you'll see how you can adapt them to make sense for everyone. So on the next slide, you see a little guy. This is Derek, And he's one of our 3-year-olds, and he had that moment of realizing, hey, my brain is inside my head. So we start very young teaching kids about their brains. On the next slide, you'll see a writer's workshop book that Mia made when she was in kindergarten. And this shows the 3 parts of the brain that we emphasize with our kids. Obviously, super simplified, but you know, they're 3. So what we talk about is we talk about the prefrontal cortex, which we say that's where we do our best thinking and learning and decision making. We talk about the hippocampus, and they can point to it kind of where it is behind your ears. And the hippocampus is really important for remembering the things that we learn. And then the amygdala, which is really that most basic part of our brain, the seat of our emotions. And that's the place where when the amygdala is overactivated, we get into that fight, flight, or freeze place. So just by understanding those simple 3 parts of the brain, kids will really open up because they've got some context for what's going on with them biologically when they're upset or scared or angry or super excited. So just giving them that little surface layer, you can then shift your conversations with them when things start to go off track. So instead of saying, wow, you're really mad, you can say, wow, your amygdala is really in charge right now. I wonder what we can do to get back up into the prefrontal cortex. And so the way that kids experience that is very different. And then they're willing to have a conversation with you about it. And so we want to give them those strategies of how to settle that amygdala down so we can get back into our prefrontal cortex. On the next slide, what you'll see is one of our kids wearing a brain hat. We make different kinds of brain hats all year long, and if kids are, I was in the cafeteria doing lunch duty one day, and this kid came in with a brain hat. He was telling me his brainy discovery that he'd made that day. But what you see in the front, that kind of long, this brain hat has seen better days, but that is a rubber band. And on the next slide, this is a book that we love using with kids. It's by Joanne Deek, called Your Fantastic Elastic Brain. And this is great if you do any work around mindset, growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work around that. And the premise of the book is that, you know, we all come into the world with different sizes of rubber bands. But the most salient feature of a rubber band is that it stretches. And so my rubber band for foreign languages is really pretty long. My rubber band for trig is really short. So, but the great thing about that short rubber band is every time I persist in those trig problems, that rubber band is stretching and stretching. So it helps kids be a little more willing to persevere when things get tough. When you just talk about, you know what, you're stretching that rubber band, you're doing great. So that book is also an app that we like. The next slide goes along with this concept. This was a project that our 3rd graders did called Brain City. And if you look at the kids in there, you'll see that they've got on like the safety goggles and they have hammers. And the idea is that they are the contractors of their brain. And so they made a city with buildings of different sizes based on their aptitudes. So Victor, I think, has a really big skyscraper for art and music, and his building for math was not as tall. But the idea is he's the contractor and he's working to build up that math building so it also becomes a skyscraper at some point.
The other thing is that you can get this activity and a bunch of other activities on our blog if that's helpful to you.
Mm-hmm. On the next slide, you'll see another way that we talk to kids about their brains. This comes from Dan Siegel, who's a child psychiatrist, and this is the hand model of the brain. So if you hold up your hand like this and you fold your thumb over, this is your amygdala. And then as you close your fingers over the top, this is your prefrontal cortex. So you can see that the amygdala and your prefrontal cortex are really connected. When your amygdala gets activated, you're scared, you're angry, what happens is you flip your lid. And so this becomes shorthand with kids, is you can say, oh, wow, looks like you flipped your lid. So, and then kids will say that to each other. You know, that makes it not so much about them as, oh yeah, my brain has flipped its lid. Importantly, if a kid is like this, it's important that we also are not like this, right? Because we're both operating from an amygdala space, and that is not going to be useful for anyone. So when that kid is in that middle of a meltdown, you've got to get yourself grounded first by either taking some deep breaths, saying, okay, I need a moment. And then when you have your brain in this space, then your role is to come help the child get back to this space. So it's just an easy kind of shorthand to use with kids that seems to make sense. The next slide shows one of our kindergartners. This is a tweet. All of our teachers are on Twitter. If you're interested, and they'll tweet out every day. It was a different way for us to try to connect with parents. But this is Matthew, and what happened with Matthew, like, this is the goal to me in all of this work that we're doing. It says Matthew's taking a brain break because he said he needed to relax and calm down. So what I love about this is Matthew realized, I'm going off the rails here. I need a moment. So he had the freedom in his class to get up, get a brain hat, go over, sit down, and pull himself together. And he realized what was happening. It was like, you know, I'm in control of this. I know my brain needs a break. So that particular brain hat had some weight to it, which can also be really calming for some kids. The next slide will show you an example of one of our 5th graders. This little guy, Eric, what they did last year was they created their goals for the year in terms of brain development. And so Eric said that he was working on his amygdala so that he could better control his anger. He said, sometimes I get mad over things that really don't matter. And holy cow, yes, he really did. I mean, he had a really pretty activated temper. So that was amazing that he had that insight. He knew what was happening, and that's what he wanted to work on. Of course, keeping it real, as we do when we're in 5th grade, he's like, I also want to work on my cerebellum so that I can increase the number of push-ups I do. So, but anyway, that was a great process for them. The next slide shows you one of our favorite tools, and this works with kids of all ages, and it works with adults. This is, I'm holding a little glitter ball, and this is a great way to teach kids about their brain. So I think what we'll do is maybe watch the video, Dan, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about it. So we love that, and we have glitter balls all over our school and all over our offices, and it really seems to make sense to kids, and it's a concrete way for them to think about it. We have little calm down baskets in our classrooms, and we always have glitter balls in those calm down baskets, so kids can just keep shaking and watching the glitter settle. until they feel like they're in a more regulated space. If you can't find glitter balls for some reason, it's, I don't know, like trying to find plutonium or something these days, you can make a glitter jar, which is just getting like a spice jar, fill it almost to the top with water, squeeze in some glitter glue and a little bit of extra fine glitter. The fine glitter seems to work better, and it's the exact same concept. So a super useful tool.
Also, AT&T helped us develop a Settle Your Glitter app that's available and free and can help kids regulate themselves using a tablet or a phone.
Yeah. So once we have taught kids a little bit about the neurology of their brains and how their brains work, then we want to go ahead and start giving them strategies to use when they realize that, oh my gosh, I'm having an amygdala hijack, so that they can begin to work on their own self-regulation. We want to move away from the adults always having to be the ones trying to impose the self-regulation. Like, that's why there's a self in front of regulation. We want the kids to be able to do it themselves. So what we know is one of the most researched tools that we can use to self-regulate, that really can be an anchor with us all the time, is our breath. And so this next section, we're going to talk about some of the ways that we use breath with our children. So Dan, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, and the one after that. Right. So these are just some of the benefits of doing focused breathing practices. Research has shown it can decrease anxiety, depression, strengthens our ability to regulate, can improve trauma symptoms, reduce impulsivity. So all kinds of great things about breath. The reason that we love using the breath is that you always have it with you, and it's free, so it's very accessible.
Great question, Heather.
Oh, yeah.
Great question from SS Gray. What's the name of the app you mentioned?
It's called Settle Your Glitter. And it's available in both iTunes and Google Play. It's free. We also have another one there that you might find useful. We won't get to it today, but it's called Breathing Bubbles. So those are two of the apps that we developed with them, so feel free to use them. And actually that video, Settle Your Glitter video, all of the videos that we're showing today are available on our YouTube channel. So just go to the Momentous Institute YouTube channel and there's a wealth of videos there for you. So if you go on to the next slide, Dan, thanks. This is the way that we introduce belly breathing to our kids. So often, I mean, even as adults, we're typically breathing from up here in our chest, that's shallow breathing, and that can just sort of perpetuate anxiety. We want kids to get good, deep belly breaths. So we use Beanie Babies, and we have our kids lie down, and we put a Beanie Baby on their belly, and we tell them to, take a deep breath in and watch the Beanie Baby rise. And then as you exhale slowly, the Beanie Baby falls. And we tell kids, see if you can have the Beanie Baby ride the wave of your breath. And that way they can really have a visual of what that feels like to get that deep belly breath. With our 3-year-olds, they're pretty hilarious when they start, like at the beginning, like you'll see a lot of, this action going on, which is fine. Like they'll eventually get the hang of it. So that's a great way to introduce it. The next slide shows another one of our favorite tools, and this works great with kids of all ages. And I've got one here. This is a Hoberman sphere. Often for some kids, they need a focus or attention when they do breathing, especially kids with anxiety. Just to tell a kid, well, I want you to just breathe deeply. That can just increase anxiety. So a Hoberman sphere is a great tool to use. As you inhale, you expand, and exhale, you contract it. So I was an assistant principal at school for a long time, and I would get kids to me that the amygdala was just, glitter was everywhere. So what you can do with this, and they come in different sizes, is you can actually get a kid who's really upset to slow their breathing down just by increasing the size that you go to a little bit each time. And then that way, then the breath starts getting slower and slower. So that's one of the ones that we love. The next slide shows another tool that we use with our kids. This comes from Susan Kaiser Greenland, who wrote a great book called The Mindful Child. This is called TikTok, and this is an example of using movement with deep breathing. So if you're at home or at work, and you're sitting, like, just feel free to join along, and you can do it with me. Thank you. I will. Okay. So the way this works is you just go tick, tock, like a clock, until you come to center. And do it again. Tick, tock, like a clock, until you come to center. One more time. Tick, tock, like a clock, until you come to center. And you take 3 deep breaths. Let's do it together. And that's all there is to it. So that can completely shift the energy level in the room. We actually take breathing breaks 3 times a day in our school. We do all different kinds of breathing, but sometimes we use a chime. So that gives the kids an auditory point of attention for when you listen to the chime as long as you can, and when you can't hear it anymore, then you just take your deep breaths, and then you ring the chime the second time, and they listen as long as they can, and then open their eyes. And so the idea is between the 2 chimes, there's a space. And as your kids get more experienced, you can increase the amount of time between the 2 chimes. So
Cheryl has a question.
Sure.
Do you have research that suggests how students use these methods beyond the classroom, at home, after school care, summer camps, etc.?
Yeah, so we don't have, like, what I can tell you is we have a lot of anecdotal stories, so I'll share one. We had 2 brothers at the school, and the little brother was still here. The big brother had graduated and gone to middle school, and it was a tough transition. He was in a very challenging middle school. He had a ton of homework, and he was completely freaked out and stressed out about it one night. And so in their bunk beds were metal. The post was metal. And so he and his brother were like, we need to do some breathing. And so he went and got a spoon, and he banged that metal bedpost, and they did breathing together and settled down, and then kind of got back on track. So, and we hear of kids, lots of times I have parents come up to me and tell me, yeah, my kid keeps telling me to breathe. So they absolutely do take it with them. I think when you're so consistent with it, as we are, it's a big part of our school culture. If you do it enough, it just becomes normal to them. And so they are taking it with them. Like the glitter ball, like before tests, having kids do some deep breathing before tests, just having that little strategy tool. They don't even have to tell anyone they're doing it. But it's very useful for them. This next slide, these are our pre-K4 kids at the Arboretum. And so what's happened with our teachers is, when you go on a field trip, like you take your class list and your first aid kit, and our teachers take a chime, because kids, you know, they will be kids on field trips and they'll get super excited and crazy. And kids will often be the ones who will call for a breathing break. So this was actually, there's a beautiful waterfall in this area. They're kind of in this covered area, and they went, took a breathing break, and then kind of got back on track, and they were ready to get back to learning at the Arboretum. So I would love to know if any of you are using breath with your students or adults that you work with. Any other techniques that you use that you like, we would love to hear about that in Q&A. The last video that we'll show you is Faith. Faith was 4 when we shot this video. And what I want you to listen for is how Faith uses her breath to show up for some frustration in an academic challenge. We're not teaching kids to breathe just to be good at breathing, right? That transfer is what we're looking for. So have a listen.
When we're mad or sad or scared or frustrated, take a deep breath. We gotta breathe and center. We take deep breaths slowly out, like this. After I breathe, I feel. I tell Miss Garcia when her feels mad or frustrated, I tell her to breathe. I was trying to match some letters and I got really frustrated. And I need to take a deep breath. And I almost got it. I almost got it by myself, and I felt just a little happy.
So we love Faith, and Dan, if you can go to the next slide, that last thing that she says of, you know, I felt I was getting frustrated. I was learning, trying to match my letters, couldn't do it, needed to take some deep breaths, and then I almost got it. I almost got it by myself, right? So even at age 4, she's internalized, how do I use my breath when I need to show up for something that's difficult? And, you know, I know many adults who've not figured that out, and how amazing that she's got that at age 4 and is able to do that.
Feedback from Susie and Nikki, Heather. Susie says she uses mindful breathing, mindful listening all the time. And Nikki works mostly with adults. She uses biofeedback heart math.
Yeah.
And so she teaches lots of swaying and counting.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I love heart math. I don't have it, but I've read a lot about it. It sounds like a wonderful resource.
Oh, look at Lib is using mindfulness-based stress reduction. They're coming into class from service learning, so their energy and thoughts tend to be pretty scattered. You should tell them about Jon Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah, so Jon Kabat-Zinn, for those of you that don't know, was kind of the father of mindfulness-based stress reduction here in this country, and we are hosting an event with him. So it will be in the spring of 2017 in March, so check our website. If you're anywhere near us, he'll be doing an evening lecture with us, and also with Alyssa Appel, who has been doing some pretty fascinating research on telomeres and how mindfulness can impact our telomeres, which are directly related to how we age. So would love for you guys to join us for that.
We're co-hosting that with the Lynn Lecture Series for any of you local friends who've maybe had great experiences with them already.
Yep. So just to kind of wrap up, the next slide, just to kind of take us back to our model. We've just been through the first 2 portions of that self-regulation line, but we feel like that's really where so much of the issues come up for folks with kids. To really be able to get them on a good path with that is a great way to start. And then the next slide, we just like to leave you with this thought. of, being the person that you needed when you were younger. I think so many of us are working with kids who are coming from really tough circumstances. And for us to be able to kind of stay grounded, even though it's incredibly challenging work at times, for us to be able to stay grounded and centered in our own mindfulness work, that we can be there for kids who need us, because it just takes that one safe, supportive relationship to turn things around for kids.
And if you aren't sure what to do, like if you can't pull up the right strategy at the right time, the best thing you can do is regulate your own nervous system and just be with that child that's having a tough time, because like this says, it's contagious. So if I'm calm, then that will extend to the child and help them calm down.
So we'd love for you to stay in touch with us. The last slide that you'll see gives you all the ways you can connect with us. Definitely recommend that you check out our blog. There's strategies for all of these different bars on our blog.
Starting a teen one.
We're starting a a series on the teenage brain is going to start with a bunch of great new strategies for that age group. And we have loved being with you.
Yes, thank you so much for this maiden voyage and for your patience, and hopefully we'll get to see you all and interact with you in future webinars or in conferences or what have you. Good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. I found myself being very thankful for those moments where I could just sit and watch the glitter fall and tick and talk. While it seems like a lot of the videos and things are related to younger children, I feel like if this can be useful in my life, it can probably be useful with my adult students as well. And so we really appreciate your time and look forward to maybe doing some more of these in the future, and perhaps seeing you at the AEE conference in October. And once again, thanks for the great work you all are doing. And thanks to everyone for coming today. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.